Continuing The Treasure of the Magi, a study of modern Zoroastrianism by James Hope Moulton. Book 1, Chapter 2, The Teaching of Zarathustra, continued. He had very little use for mythology, except to supply him occasionally with a figure. Well, if he was a prophet, he wasn't inventing these things as it went along, but people remembered vaguely and they tried to put it back in a form for the most part. It does not seem probable that he would have favored any interpretation which made Ahura Mazda either twin or parent of the evil principle. It is best to assume that the word twin is thrown out for a momentary purpose without thought of logical developments. This is the easier to assume when we remember how completely free Zarathustra is from any material theogonies. To call Ahura Mazda father of good thought means for him only the use of a spiritual metaphor. In that case, what he is thinking of is the logical eternity of good and evil as an obverse and reverse which cannot be conceived of apart. If we say God is light, we mean that in him is no darkness at all. If in heaven there is death no more, the very blessedness of life is thrown into relief by the contrast of what our sage calls not life, which has been overcome, and that since evil is eternal, for a world wherein the will of God, which is our peace, is everywhere lovingly followed, will not have lost the shuddering memory of a rebelliousness that brought all woe. Zarathustra is manifestly concerned here with the tremendous fact of choice. Free will is the pivot of his whole theology. Neither angels nor men ever did good under compulsion. Well, the Ahuras, God's loyal host of angels don't have a choice, but the Devis, again, they have a choice. But it's not the same. You program a computer, the computer has been compelled to do something. Well, that's not really the term that you use, right? When thou, Mazda, in the beginning didst create beings and men's selves by thy thought and intelligences, when thou didst make life clothed with body, when thou madest actions and teachings whereby one may exercise choice at one's free will, then lifts up his voice the false speaker or the true speaker, he that knows or he that knows not, each according to his own heart and thought, passing from one to another. Piety pleads with a spirit in which there is wavering. Yasna 31, 11 and 12. God designs to plead, but will never coerce. We may illustrate the Johannine writings, where a truth is often set forth in positive and negative form. Thus, 1 John 1, 5, 6, 2, 27, 3, 11 and 12, 5, 12, etc. Choice is the supreme fact, and nothing can relieve intelligent beings of their responsibility. When, therefore, Zarathustra emphasizes so tremendously the gulf that yawns between the two tempers which exist together as inevitably as convex and concave in the same curve, he is simply hammering home his fundamental precept that right and wrong have no concord, that compromise is impossible, and we must make our choice, knowing that all eternity depends on it. The whole ring of the passage forbids the recognition of mere metaphysics. If the prophet gives a thought to the origin of evil, it is just as the doctor searches for the cause of his patient's malady. Both are thinking only of the problem of a cure. The passage we have quoted tells how the choice went. Of those two spirits or mental attitudes, one which turned towards falsehood. Bergevant chose to do the worst things, while the holiest chose Asha. We must pause here again to remind ourselves that our text is not in English, wholly with its comparative and superlative spenta Spania, Spanista, is an extremely common term in the Gathas. The word is inherited from the most primitive antiquity, for we find it as far away as Lithuanian on the Baltic, where Suentas is holy, and further west still, in our own family, the non-philologist must take it on trust that Shakespeare's unhouseled contains it. But in the history of words, their distant origin matters much less than their latter environment, and a false etymology may affect the interpretation far more than the true one. The differences in use in a language is different than, okay, there's a development from a term in some language into this term. Well, if it has a different meaning, it has a different meaning. Let's not. There happened to be a verb. I'm not saying he's doing it. I'm saying a lot of people play this false etymology game. There happened to be a verb, the flexion of which brought it into close apparent connection with the adjective spenta. The two latter occur together in a Gathic verse, where a play on the similarity is obvious. A holy man. It advances to Asha. Yasna 51:21. This suggests that the connotation of holy was beneficent, from association with this really unrelated verb. It was the verb benefit from which sa'ashyant, he who shall deliver, is in the future participle. This traditional understanding of the word is supported by the fact that in the second and crucial passages quoted above, Yasna 45:2, the antithesis of holier is enemy, angra. See below. Oh. There is obviously a fitness in recognizing friendly and fiendly as the association of the two spirits here. It was then the most beneficent disposition that turned to the right, and the prophet's radiant optimism stops to throw out a jewel of inspiring poetry. It is that spirit that must win, for it wears the massy heaven as a garment. Now, poetry implies like some sort of extra for style, or something just for style purposes, and Revelation doesn't quite come like that. There is no doubt in Zarathustra's mind that the universe is friendly to us, and of course, there is no question on which side is the wise Lord. All who would please him make the good choice. On the other side, the wrong choice was made by the demons. Who were they? Their name identical with the Indian Deva and the Latin Deus, in the age when Indian and Iranian lived together as one nation, belonged to the bright nature gods. Gyas, the sky, Mithra, the light, Soma, the drink of immortality, which foams up in the cup of the waxing moon, and the rest. Zarathustra inherited a more abstract cult, which it had in it the seeds of an ethical monotheism, but it was not theology that brought him to condemn these ancestral entities so severely. Well, it was, but there were other things, misassociation with God is followed by other stuff. And to make their name an actual name for devils, again, no prophet invented, none of the God's apostles invented languages. They just used what languages were there. He saw the wild nomads offer sacrifice to Indra, or to victory. Vritragna in Sanskrit, Vereth Ragna in Avestan, and then go off on a cruel raid upon his peaceful husbandmen, and formed the same opinion on their religion that we form when we hear of Turks bowing before Allah, the All-Merciful, in the mosque before going out to exterminate Armenians in conflict with Islamic law. I mean, their killing these people was in conflict with Islamic law. For ye have brought it out to pass that men who do the worst things shall be called beloved of the Davas. Yasna 32:4. Devdas Jushta, different transliteration with this book. Deva us Justa. The Vedic compound, which is used here in its Iranian form, had a once purely good meaning. Religion had been tried by its deeds and found wanting, and Zarathustra, who never doubted the real existence of spiritual beings, good and evil, accounted for the sorrowful facts before him by his own great doctrine of choice. These old world entities had been forced to choose between right and falsehood, and they made the wrong decision. The case of two of them must be specifically noticed in preparation for the next chapter. What are the allusions in these cryptic verses? He it is that destroys the lore, who declares that the ox and the sun are the worst thing to behold with the eyes. Yasna 32:10. To his, Zarathustra's undoing, Brahma and the Kavis have long devoted their purposes and energies, for they set themselves to help the false, and that it may be said, the ox shall be slain, that it may kindle the averter of death to help us. Yasna 32:14. Yeah, it looks like that's. When wilt thou smite the filthiness of this intoxicant, through which the Karapans evilly deceive, and the wicked lords of the land with purpose fell? Yasna 48:10. And intoxicants are often used with mind control. That's why the psychological effect of sorcery does more than any drug use by itself or anything does, but sorcery linking to ritual drug use. That's the definition I'm using here. There's other meanings, but we have here fierce denunciation of the Dava Yasna, the worship of the fire beings, as carried on by the Kavis, chief hostile to the reform, and the Karapans, priests of their worship. Bendva and Grehma were their respective ringleaders. Now, Duraosha, averter of death, is the standing epithet of Hyoma, the Indian Soma, and the latter Avesta. We cannot fail to recognize the prophet's wrath against the wild nocturnal orgy, primed with maddening drink, under religious sanctions, at which the poor husbandmen's cattle were slain with shouts of joy. Yasna 32:12. And when we recall the Mithraic Taurobodium, the sacramental slaying of an ox in commemoration of Mithra's primeval sacrifice, the probability becomes fairly strong that even Mithra himself was implicated in the denunciation. Actually, not quite. The worship of Mithra was, but Mithra was included in this, right? Oh wait, which one? Is it Mithra is the Persian side and Mithra? Oh, see, that's the confusion. I don't remember which one's which, but Mithra and Varuna, Mithra and, yeah, I think it's Mithra and the Persian side. Of course his name does not appear, nor that of Hyoma, The priests who preserved the Gathas would certainly not retain in their worship stanzas that denounced such sacred names, though, as we can see, the names of Mithra and Hyoma in the latter Avesta denote very different beings from those which Zarathustra repudiated. The very silence of the Gathas is evidently evidence enough that the great name of Mithra was not venerated by the Reformer. Well, certainly not a being that the Reformer worshipped, who could not possibly have been ignorant of it. The gulf between the founder and the next stage of the Parsi religion could not more vividly appear, but the real nature of the difference must be reserved for consideration in the next chapter. We have seen how the angels kept not the first estate. How man began with the wrong choice is enigmatically set forth in this stanza. In these sins, we know Yima was involved in Vivavant's son. In these sins, we know Yima was involved, Vivavant's son, who, desiring to satisfy men, gave our people flesh of the ox to eat. Yasna 32:8. They make the number so small it's almost blurred. Well, it's sort of blurred. A few lines about, we are told that the demons defrauded mankind of happy life and of immortality. The interpretation of this false story is discussed elsewhere. It should be noticed that the interpretation is James Hope Moulton's own, and he doesn't wish for it to be asserted that this is a universal interpretation or anything. Okay. Apparently, Yima, deceived by the demons, anticipated the divine gift of the restoration and gave his subjects the flesh of the mystic ox by which immortality was to be secured. In the full form of the story, we should doubtless hear how his action failed to achieve its purpose. The latter Avesta tells us of his punishment. It is evident that Zarathustra goes into very little detail upon speculative questions as to the beginnings of evil. He finds a house on fire, and he is too much concerned with putting it out to spare much thought for the cause of the conflagration, though he flings out wrathful allusions to the incendiaries whose hand he recognizes. We turn with him to the doctrine of sin as it is today, and to the punishment that awaits it hereafter. Zarathustra is not at all precise in his treatment of sin, but the general principles he lays down compensate for the absence of particulars. By far the most fundamental doctrine is that which takes us down to the springs of action and makes thought of equal importance with word and deed, of greater importance, we should say, since good thought is enthroned where good word and deed do not appear. Violence and cruelty, arrogance, and above all falsehood are expressly condemned. And the great triad of word, thought, and deed, so constantly emphasized, we cannot miss Zarathustra's intention to include the planning of and longing for such things in the same category as their accomplishment in word and action. How, for Zarathustra's lost teaching, amplified the ethical code in detail, we of course have no means of knowing. The Gathas have almost disproportionate space given, so we may say, to the punishments which await sin in the hereafter. The prophet is profoundly convinced that the proclamation of these will turn sinners from the evil way. Well, it's important to differentiate. This is all I support. This is all I oppose. Through this kindly spirit, Mazda Ahura, and through the fire, thou wilt give the division of good to the two parties, with support of piety and right. This verily will convert many who are ready to hear Yasna 47:6. The fire here and often, in the Gathas, is the ordeal flame, the flood of molten metal, Aya Kshushta, which is to be poured forth at the last from above, to destroy all evil. Often the word metal is used to express the same idea. According to the latter apocalyptic, the righteous are to pass through it, as through a stream of warm milk, but the wicked and all pertaining to wickedness will be burnt up. There are various other elements in the imagery of judgment where Zarathustra may well have found established in popular mythology before his time. Now, yeah, the idea of punishment and reward in the hereafter goes back as far as anybody knows. That includes fires and poking and all sorts of stuff. There are various other elements in the imagery of judgment which Zarathustra may well have found established in popular mythology before his time. Such cases he retained the imagery where it was in itself harmless and served to make more vivid the truth with which he was concerned, but he apparently took no trouble to correlate these figures, which for him serve only a passing purpose. It would be quite impossible to form from his teaching anything like a constant picture. Each image comes in independently to heighten a moral or spiritual conception, and is then dropped. And this is of the essence of apocalyptic, which Zarathustra was the first great thinker to use as a vehicle for truth. Well, again, it's presumed by the armchair anthropologist theories of the 17 and 1800s, but it wasn't quite disproved when this book was written. We are very familiar with the principle of interpretation as supplied in the supreme example of apocalyptic, the book that closes the canon of Christian scripture, which, just like John, is a rewrite of an earlier book, but a rewrite of a later book, and before any of the canonical Gospels, but after Paul and his buddies wrote their books. So Paul and his the Christian side of the Bible, Paul, his buddies, Revelation, the John rewrite of Bacchus, Barabbas wrote Revelation in its earlier form, but that's, so that was much later, a few centuries later. And then you have the canonical Gospels, the other three canonical Gospels, 120s, 130s, 140s. The book of Daniel is also considered apocalyptic in the sort of sense that they're referring to here. It may well take us up to these apocalyptic figures that we may see what is the general conception of retribution that Zarathustra sets forth by their use. The fire and the molten metal are specially concerned with the general judgment. As in Christian eschatology, from the very nature of the subject, it is often implausible to isolate imagery attaching to the end from that pertaining to the individual's destiny. The most conspicuous and picturesque feature in the vision of individual judgment is the bridge. Much mythological embellishment is found in latter Parsi eschatology, and was very probably a survival from Aryan antiquity, in which the idea of a bridge of souls was conspicuous. The bridge may have been suggested by the rainbow or the Milky Way. It was said to rest upon Mount Alburz and to span the abyss of hell, its farther end reaching to paradise. Its most striking characteristic was its expanding into a broad causeway, when the righteous passed over, and shrinking into a razor's edge for the wicked, so that they fell down from it into the bottomless pit below. There is an adaptation of this in the Muslim As-Sirat's arch. It is not found in the Gathas, and the absence is significant. Probably the idea tasted too much of magic for Zarathustra. He keeps the bridge, but he gives it a new name, which bears his own unmistakable sign manual. It is now the Bridge of the Separator. Chindato Peratu. The separation between the good and the bad is done in the fact, before the bridge is passed, who is the Chinvant? The answer is what we should expect. In Yasna 46:17, the prophet promises his son-in-law Jamaspa to recount his wrongs in paradise. Before him who shall separate the wise and the unwise through right, his prudent counselor, even Mazda Ahura, he is to act himself as the people's advocate at the judgment, and he is himself to be their guide across the bridge. Those whom I impel to your adoration, with all these will I cross the bridge of the separator. Yasna 46:10. There is, however, a suggestion of a still more exalted function for him, albeit in a passage, the translation of which is not perfectly secure. The action, the word, and the worship by which I will give for thee immortality in right, O Mazda, and the dominion of welfare. Yasna 34:1. He will be judge at the last by the message he gives. The thought is like that of John 12:48. We may put it down to a rather later day than the sacred formula in Gathic dialect, in which the community declares that Zarathustra is to be both Lord Ahu here and Judge Ratu hereafter. But let's not, notice the abbreviated form. It's not specific in sort of, they're not calling him some sort of god. If by reason of these things the better part, but it's quite explicitly anticipated in another verse of his hymns. If by reason of these things the better part is not in sight for the soul, then will I come to you all as the judge of the parties twain, whom Ahura Mazda knoweth, that we may live according to the right. Yasna 31:2. So the way, the truth, and the light, that passage in the Bible, each nation is judged by the message that their prophet came with. Mazda, who will be Lord Ahu at the resurrection, appoints his prophet to be its judge, Ratu. This is therefore quite consistent with the supreme judgment of Mazda, and we may add with personal humility on the human prophet's part. He never gives us the impression of making claims for himself. He is utterly lost in his message, and is entirely as a messenger of truth that he claims to be appointed judge at the last. The separating which Mazda accomplishes before the bridge is connected with an impressive figure of thy fire, O Ahura, that is mighty, through right, promised and powerful. We desire that it may be for the faithful man with manifested delight, but for the enemy with visible torment, according to the pointing of the hand. Yasna 34:4. The fire itself shall declare each man's work. The figure is combined with that of the divine hand pointing in another striking stanza. Then shall I recognize thee as strong and holy, Mazda, when by the hand in which thou thyself dost hold the destinies that thou wilt assign to the false and the righteous, by the glow of thy fire, whose power is right, the might of good thought shall come to me. Yasna 43:4. Here good thought, which in this context means paradise, comes to the prophet himself by the pointing of the hand. Any difficulty which might have been felt as the apparent coincidence of function between Mazda and Zarathustra at the judgment is discounted further by the appearance of other names yet. In Yasna 43:12, Sarasha, obedience, comes as angel of judgment, as in the latter Avesta, followed by treasure-laden destiny, a she who shall render to men severely the destinies of the twofold award. So here, as in many other places, Mazda's attributes, described as his fellow Ahuras, perform a function belonging essentially to God in his unity of nature. This is, of course, sharply differentiated from the sense in which the human teacher acts as a judge, as his stanza just cited will itself show when examined as a whole. We return to inherited material when we find that merits and demerits were weighed, and that the result determined the pointings of the hand and the passage of the bridge. The idea is fundamental, although there is only one direct mention of it in the Gathas, and the crucial word there has to be rendered by conjecture. Is the possession of thy good dominion, Mazda, is that of thy destiny assured to me, O Ahura? Will thy manifestation, O thou right, be welcome to the pious, even to the weighing of actions, by the good spirit? Yasna 48:8. My stomach's rumbling right here sometimes. I don't know if you can hear it. I end up apologizing for sounds that can be heard by me, but not. I guess you can't catch it on the video. I don't know, but I've definitely heard my stomach rolling a few times or something. Our confidence in the presence, or me squeaking back and forth in this chair or my shoe. Our confidence in the presence of this old Aryan and latter Avestan idea in the Gathas is confirmed by the presence of an obvious and troublesome corollary. If men go to heaven when their merits outweigh their demerits, and to hell when the scale dips the other way, what about the case when the balance is even, and there is not even the estimation of a hair between the two scales? Twice this case is presumed. According as it is with the laws that belong to the present life, so shall the judge act with the most just deed towards the man of the lie, and the man of the right, and him whose false things and good things balance. Yasna 33:1. Whoso, O Mazda, makes his thought now better